Nobody sat me down and said, this is the department, this is how it works, here's an organogram. I turned up, I was given a laptop, an email address and my pass, and was basically told to get on with it.
No wonder we were exhausted. I mean, I look back at that period, and luckily I was in my early 30s, so I was young and full of beans, but I was working 80, 90, 100-hour weeks for 4 years.
Special advisors. They're some of the most important and most misunderstood figures in government. If you've seen Yes Minister or The Thick of It, you probably won't have the best impression of them. But in reality, these political appointments play a crucial role in government, being the voice of the minister in their department, shaping policy agendas and managing the media. And as a new government gets up and running, across Whitehall, scores of SpAds are getting to grips with their roles. Welcome to SpAdcast, a special inside briefing series from the Institute for Government. Over the next few weeks, we'll be looking at the role of special advisors in government, talking to several former SpAds about their experiences. We'll look at their relationships with ministers and civil servants, how they work across Whitehall, and how their careers come to an end. I'm Jack Whirlidge, Senior Researcher at the Institute for Government and a former Special Advisor. In this first episode, we're starting at the beginning, with how SpAds are recruited, how they learnt to navigate Whitehall, and the surprises they found as they did. Formally, all SpAds are appointed by the Prime Minister, but in practice, it's individual Secretaries of State who make the call about their own advisors. As long as Number 10 doesn't object, and it's pretty rare for Number 10 to block a SpAD appointment, they can pretty much have whoever they want. This means that how to find a SpAD is also up to the relevant minister. The jobs aren't advertised, there's no prescribed recruitment process to follow. So how do you get one of these jobs? And what kind of experience do SpAds tend to have?
I didn't know Vince at all when I got the job.
Emily Walsh was a special advisor to Vince Cable during the coalition government.
I knew his agent that I had worked for at the London Assembly for a couple of years. And I'd actually left politics at that point. I was working in agency, and I remember one weekend I was going around the Royal Academy and I got a phone call from Dee saying, Vince needs a special advisor. Are you interested? That was 6:30. 7 o'clock, I was on the phone to Vince, just having a conversation about it.
As so often in these processes, Emily didn't get much notice before meeting her future boss.
He said, well, come to my house tomorrow morning for an interview. Cue panic. How do you prepare for the biggest job of your life with about 12 hours to spare? And I had a grueling 3.5-hour interview where I felt I had lost a dress size by the end of it. And which was also slightly surreal because his wife was crocheting in the window at the same time during the interview. And then just as I thought the interview was drawing to a close, he gave me a speech to critique, which I thought was almost the final straw. But eventually, next day, Monday evening, I got a call that I'd got the job. So it all happened really, really quickly. To my knowledge, the job wasn't advertised.
It's fair to say that this is on the extreme end of SpAD recruitment. Not everyone has to endure a 3-hour interview. But what Emily's experience does show is that SpAD recruitment is almost always done through word of mouth. This was Wes Ball's experience. He'd worked for the Labour Party for several years before becoming Hilary Benn's special advisor at the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs.
Hilary was looking for a new advisor, and the word went out through the networks. But it was actually close to pretty, because sometimes these processes are quite informal. So I did know Hilary. I didn't know him well, but I did know him. But I did have to do a covering letter. And then I went in for an interview with Hilary and had to also write a speech I think I had about like an hour or something to turn around a speech from a briefing. And then I had an interview with Hilary and the PPS. So, that I think in SpAD recruitment terms, that almost amounts to an overly arduous process.
Sometimes, though, the process is far less formal, and you can be in the running for several SpAD jobs before one eventually comes through.
So it was a long journey towards becoming a special advisor.
Emma Dean became one of Matt Hancock's SpAds in the Department of Health and Social Care in 2019.
So I started campaigning for and volunteering for the party pre-2010 election. So I worked with a number of candidates up in the northeast of England where I'm from and where I was at university, got involved in Conservative Future and campaigned for the party over several years. At the same time, sort of left university, went and worked in think tanks and campaign groups and then into the private sector and public affairs. And I had a couple of interviews with Secretaries of State during that time and got very close to getting the job in various departments, but didn't quite get there. And then a number of my friends went into the Boris Johnson government. I reached out and said, would there be an opportunity? If so, would you mind just making sure that my CV made it into the right pile for interviews? In a couple of cases, I only found out that I was in the running for a job because a SpAd or even the Secretary of State themselves would ring or text me, and I had to sort of double check, is this actually the Secretary of State who's texting me? And asked to come in, usually at pretty short notice. I can remember sitting waiting for one Secretary of State for almost an hour, and I got 6 minutes with them. I ended up being offered the job, but you had to go in and it was incredibly sort of short and sharp.
The process is often no clearer for the Secretaries of State making these decisions. If you've been reshuffled from one cabinet post to another, you'll probably take some of your SpAds with you. But when you're appointed Secretary of State for the first time, you've got some more difficult decisions to make. Nikki Morgan was first appointed to Cabinet in a reshuffle in July 2014.
I hadn't expected to be appointed to the Cabinet as Secretary of State role in that July 2014 reshuffle. I'd been sort of told fairly certainly that I was going to stay in the Treasury. And so it was a surprise to get the call. One of the big decision points actually was, do you keep your predecessors' special advisors? Or do you say, no, I want to bring in my own set of special advisors? But actually, having spoken to some fellow ministers and secretaries of state, they were pretty clear that, look, you need your own team. And so I did have to say thank you, but no thank you to the couple of special advisors left in the department. And that's not easy because they're in a state of some shock that their boss has been moved on and they didn't expect that. And then started the process of trying to find some people. And because it was an unexpected appointment, I really didn't know who I was going to turn to. So you are then very reliant on recommendations. You know, suddenly your WhatsApp is flooded with people who are saying, look, I'd love to come work with you. Can we have a coffee? And so I picked the brains of, contacts in Westminster who helped me to find my first special advisor. But it was very much word of mouth recommendations. And an awful lot of it is down to personal fit.
For reasons we'll come on to in the next episode, that point about personal fit is vital. Making sure you can get on with someone and trust them is probably the most important part of recruiting a SpAd.
Interviewing is important. I suppose I'm a sort of person that actually, and I think in politics often, you will make judgments quite quickly about people, partly on the basis of who's recommended them. So do you trust their judgment? A part of it is you get a sense of, do people sort of use the language that you're comfortable with immediately? Do they get where you're going? Do they get the challenge that you've been set? And also, I think with all these things as well, in terms of an interview, are they listening to you, the person, the Secretary of State, rather than telling you what they think the policy answer should be? For me, that was a very important distinction.
It's a very odd experience because you're having to sort of work out whether you gel with this person.
Emma Dean again.
Because so much of it is about sort of trust and about how much you get on with each other, whether you're going to be able to spend sort of 15, 16-hour days with each other, whilst also them trying to get a bit of a mark in terms of what your values are, what your background is, what you want to bring, and doing that in 6 minutes is very tricky.
That was less of a problem for Emily Walsh. Vince Cable took a thorough approach during their 3-hour interview.
I think he wanted to really understand how I thought, because he wasn't quizzing me about Labour policy, or as in labour market policy or business policy, because he understood I had no knowledge of that. But he wanted to understand my thinking, and there were lots of questions about both my experience on the media side, but also on the political side, how I'd handled things, and really questions about judgment. So really trying to test my judgment and analysis of the politics. And we spent a lot of time talking about that, yeah.
Once you've been through whatever process the Secretary of State decided to follow, if you do get the job, you're often expected to drop everything and start as soon as possible. And it can be a bit of a leap of faith. You'll often be making sacrifices in your personal life to go into a very insecure job.
For me, it was pretty clear that we were heading towards a general election. It takes quite a leap of faith to leave a very solid, well-paid job in the private sector to go into government. You know, you're going to take a pay cut. You know that I was in the middle of trying to get a mortgage that was going to have to go on hold. And
then you're straight into the confusion and chaos of your first few days in government.
It's such a unique job.
Where's Ball again?
I came into the department before I started to meet with some of the private office and to just get a bit of an understanding of it. And that was incredibly helpful. But it's such a unique job that I don't think anything really can prepare you for what it is.
Oh, it was really tricky.
Emma Dean.
And I think part of that was because Matt had been in the department for, I think, about 18 months by the time I joined. He had his comms special advisor, his parliamentary special advisor who'd been there. So I was sort of joining as an adjunct rather than joining completely afresh. So I can't really say that I got an onboarding process. Nobody sat me down and said, this is the department, this is how it works. Here's an organogram. I turned up, I was given a laptop, an email address and my pass, and was basically told to get on with it.
Aled McLean-Jones worked in the Treasury as a special advisor to the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Steve Barclay. He joined just after the COVID pandemic hit, which presented its own unique challenges.
And then I joined the department in April, basically, 2020. I was there a little bit after the first wave had kind of hit. And for myself as well, there was a lot of trying to find my own feet, right? Because there's not really a manual out there that, or like a sort of training course or like a graduate development program or something. You're just in there and you have to kind of very quickly and instinctively pick up the cadences of the department that you are in charge of. Probably one of the harder bits about starting in the pandemic is that the role I did, the Chief Secretary SpAd, it's all about relationships. It's all about having, because you're saying no all the time, right? So being in a position to be able to say no and maintain a relationship is really important. And so that was definitely quite tricky, was basically having to try and build those relationships, because I wasn't in the office for a pretty significant bit of time because I started during lockdown.
Trying to get to grips with how government really works can throw up some surprises. It certainly looks very, very different once you're on the inside.
It was definitely a shock for me, because you think, having worked around Westminster and politics and having worked in public affairs, that you know how government works, and I can tell you now that you don't. There were so many sort of things that happen in terms of the nuances of the day, processes which don't get talked about because there's no need for them to, outside of private office and outside of department, which needs explaining.
I think the sheer amount of paper that's involved in getting anything done.
Fraser Raleigh was a SpAd to David Lidington during Theresa May's government. Even though he'd spent years in Parliament, he still had several surprises when he went into government.
From the outside, you think that government can move relatively quickly and make decisions very quickly. And I think actually when it has to, it can, and it can expedite processes. But the sheer amount of paperwork and writing round that's required to get a little bit of movement on policies is maybe not always apparent from the outside. The second thing that I would say is the ability that you have to really shape the agenda is limited, because you are dealing with commitments that have been made by your predecessors, things that are already in train, policies that you've inherited, and you have to continue to push down the line. You don't come in with a completely blank sheet of paper and say, right, this is what I would like to do. Also about how much visibility you really have of what's happening across the rest of government, because if you talk to a special advisor about what's happening in DEFRA when they're sitting in DESNES, they'll have very little understanding unless it's directly related to what they do. So the sheer scale of what's happening in government behind the scenes, and the surface level visibility that a lot of government has over what's actually happening was probably the biggest surprise.
Most special advisors coming in don't quite know how the system works.
Hannah Guerin was a civil servant before joining Priti Patel's special advisor team in the Home Office. She'd spent a lot of time around ministers and SpAds as an official, but still wasn't fully aware of how much responsibility she was taking on.
I did know it like the back of my hand, so I definitely had an advantage there. But I don't think even that experience quite prepares you for the scale of responsibility and the scale of tasks that you have to do, particularly in a place like the Home Office. So even as a civil servant, I don't think I quite realised the pressures that special advisors face. And you are in the coalface, both in terms of dealing with what's going on in the department, trying to support your Secretary of State, and also the kind of brokering between departments. So whether that be Number 10, Treasury, trying to get things done collectively.
So given those surprises and the shocks of entering government for the first time, how can you prepare? Fraser Raleigh again.
I was lucky that the the previous special advisors who'd done my role just before me were willing to talk to me and sit down and say, right, these are the things you need to look out for. This is how I did it. And I think that's enormously important because there is no real job description that can prepare you for what it actually looks like or what you need to be looking out for. So the network of former special advisors is really important. And I always tried as I went through to then sort of pay it forward and speak to the next special advisor coming through.
The other thing that new SpAds need to do is work out how they fit into the wider SpAd team in their department. What do they do and what do their colleagues do? The classic arrangement is for a department to have 2 special advisors, one policy SpAd and one media SpAd. This was Wes Ball's experience during the last Labour government.
My responsibilities in the split between me and the other advisor was very much the media SpAd. My jobs were sort of supporting the other ministers, political clearinghouse, handling Parliament, handling the party, so policy in its broadest sense.
But this arrangement is increasingly rare. It's not unusual now for cabinet ministers to have 4 or 5 SpAds, and the overall number has hugely increased. The last time the government published data for March 2023 under Rishi Sunak's premiership, there were 117 SpAds in total. 41 of those were working for the Prime Minister in number 10, doing all kinds of different jobs. But even if you discount those, cabinet ministers still have far more SpAds than they used to.
So I think one thing that was quite different back then to how it is now, I think now most secretaries of state have quite large teams.
Emily Walsh, who was a special advisor during the coalition.
We had a tiny team of 2. Now, Biz was at the time, the Department for Business as it was at the time of Innovation and Skills. It was a £14 billion department, 3,500 staff. There was about 12 directorates. It was a big beast. And 2 of us covered the whole waterfront. The assumption was that my sort of co-SpAd at the time, he covered the majority of policy. And I think because Vince made it very clear to me from the get-go, media coverage was very important to him. So that was very much the focus for me was to try and drive positive media coverage for him and for the department.
In a complicated department, it's not easy to cover the whole waterfront, as Emily put it, with just 2 SpAds. And it's largely the need to divide up policy responsibilities, as well as a trend for having a SpAd devoted to parliamentary engagement that's driven the increase in numbers. This was Hannah Guerin's experience in the Home Office.
In our team, we deliberately had 2 policy advisors just because there is so much, the policy breadth is vast. So I covered immigration, national security, and a colleague covered the criminal justice system and women and girls. And that worked really well. We also had another special advisor covering communications and another covering parliamentary engagement. All really key things. We probably should have had more people to delegate things to. But broadly in the departments that I then went to, there was a similar split. And I think that does work quite well. I do think having someone dedicated on communications and policy is important. One thing that worked quite well, which I saw later, was having someone now focused on the kind of the digital element of comms, which is an interesting kind of evolution of the role.
So there are lots of ways to organise a SpAd team, but what does the job actually involve day to day? While any SpAd is pretty much always on, it's media SpAds whose lives are properly taken over by their work.
I mean, my day very often would start with calls from 6 a.m.
Emily Walsh.
From the minute the Today programme started, and would end in terms of calls about midnight after the first editions had gone to bed. And if there were headlines that needed to be amended or copy that was incorrect, that was my role to be on top of that. Things didn't stop at weekends because very generally the Sunday papers would have a story in. So you would have, Saturday mornings, your Friday evenings or Saturday mornings were ruined. And then there was this sort of golden hour between about 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock on a Saturday and about 8 o'clock where you could have a life or sleep or do your washing or do your shopping. And then basically it started again on Saturday evening when the first editions came, and you'd often have a call with number 10 for first editions for Sundays, especially if you were doing the Sunday shows. So it was pretty relentless. It was very much a 24/7 job for most of the time. And I used to joke with I think a lot of my friends, when I took the job, they thought I died for 4 years because a lot of them didn't see me. And I really take my hat off to anyone who can do that job and hold down a relationship at the same time as well, or even more have children. They're incredibly demanding jobs, and no wonder we were exhausted. I mean, I look back at that period, and luckily I was in my early 30s, so I was young and full of beans, but I was working 80, 90, 100-hour weeks for 4 years practically. They were big jobs, and we were living on a diet of caffeine and cortisol.
Even for more policy-focused SpAds, the media is still an important part of the day.
And I don't think there was ever a typical day apart from the fact that it always started with press cuttings very early in the morning.
Where's Paul?
And these were in the old days, so there were physical press cuttings, and we didn't have WhatsApp, and we didn't have Playbook. So, I'd get into the office about 8 o'clock in the morning, and there'd be a wodge of press cuttings. And because it's DEFRA, I'd also have been up at 5:30 to listen to Farming Today as well.
I think the first thing is in the morning, I'd spend a lot of time just reading like newspapers, right?
Aled started the day in a similar way at the Treasury and Cabinet Office.
So the first bit was kind of like information gathering, okay, like what's going on today, right? Because particularly in the centre, if there's a problem on page 6, it's going to come your way, but on the way for becoming a page 6 problem to a page 1 problem, right? So that was kind of the first thing, was basically just like information gathering.
But the day quickly moved on to other things.
I think then a lot of it was around kind of unblocking things. So it was phone calls and emails and conversations. And like every single day was like that. So I would normally wake up to like a message or like an email that was like, like normally like, Aled X's SpAd might be on the phone to you in a couple of minutes about why, or someone from the policy unit being like, there's this really important thing and it's been blocked. We don't know what to do. Can you help us? So then during the course of the day, it would be, just like whack-a-mole. Problem arrives. Okay. All right. Can I solve this? Okay. I probably can. Right. I need to speak to these 3 people to solve this problem. Speak to these 3 people. Okay. All right. This problem is solved, or it's kind of solved. I don't know. But anyway, I'm going to move on. That mole's been whacked. Then another one.
At the Ministry of Justice, Fraser found that clearing out the simpler tasks and working out priorities was the best way to start the day.
Ministry of Justice starting every morning by going through about 40 or 50 parliamentary questions, answers, means that if you need to send it back to the department, you're still on track for responding to them on time, and you're not causing a blockage yourself. And also I found getting in early and working out what the priorities were for the day or the week, and then starting to get the system thinking about it as well, so that you're not trying to compete with other people, and they come in and say, right, okay, this is what we need to get an answer for, and you create a little bit of the momentum yourself, rather than sort of coming in and being told this is what today's about. You say, okay, well, this may well be what today ends up being about, but before we get to that, we need to separate the urgent from the important. I think is the key thing that's difficult in government, is everything is always urgent.
Because everything always seems urgent, and because SpAds have such a wide remit, it's very easy to get sucked into things. And before you know it, you've spent hours scrutinising some policy proposal that your Secretary of State just doesn't care about. That's exactly why it's important to know what your Secretary of State's priorities, and therefore your priorities, really are.
But there are certain things that are important to you and require creating time and making a priority that you need to, as a special advisor, ensure doesn't get lost. So for us, really taking the union seriously in the Cabinet Office was something that we were invested in, building the relationships with the devolved administrations to a position of trust, if not agreement, on most things, and trying to get the cross-Whitehall mentality about the union shifted slightly.
So the need to decide where you want to invest your time is an important early lesson. But as Wes found, that doesn't mean it's an easy one.
I spent a bit of time just trying to step back and get a bit of advice from private office about what was really important and what wasn't really important, and just trying to work out what the prioritization was, I found really hard.
Nothing, I think, can prepare you as a SpAd to really understanding to the volume of information that you're subjected to when you start. It is a veritable tsunami of data and information and policy.
Emily Walsh.
I think I had 1,500 emails a day to get through. You are just deluged, and the opportunity to get involved in everything is there every day. So you have to learn to prioritize very early and really try to establish what is the Northern Star that's going to guide your work? What are the 2 or 3 things that you think are going to help make your boss famous, and really sticking to those and having those core priorities that you come back to again and again? Because of course you're going to get knocked left, right and centre, but being able to come back and know what you're coming back to.
Now, even if you do have those core things that are driving your work, the nature of the role can make it really hard to stick to them. Hannah Guerin again.
So in the Home Office, the way the setup is that there's a meeting room for the Home Secretary, and then next door is the Special Advisor's office. And I would describe myself as constantly flitting between that door and the department. I was rarely sat at my desk for more than an hour, and there was always someone in a meeting with Pretty. So if I wasn't in it, a member of the team would be in it. So you became really, really good at multitasking. Like I would be sending emails whilst trying to listen to what was going on in the meeting, and then scheduling things so that people could stay after so we could decide what the next steps were on certain issues. But you really are, I think, a combination of a juggler and a deliverer, trying to spin as many plates as you can in the day. But I do think the Home Office is particularly unique because you can't really ever know that your time is going to be dedicated to a task that you could just leave at the end of the week. Like that Friday could just absolutely go in a second because something just happens and you've got to react.
This is why it's so difficult to prioritise, for ministers as well as SpAds. Fundamentally, your role has to be reactive.
And I think this was one of the hard things of being a special advisor, is that you can't really carve out time for like things, particularly like, 'cause it's such a reactive role.
Aled McLean-Jones.
And the really important thing was not filling my day up with things that were, like that were rigid and like immovable. So like, I'd never be like, oh, I'm going to go to like a conference for 6 hours, right? Or I'm going to have like a 3-hour roundtable that I can't leave, because one email, one message, one phone call, and like that could be the end of the day and the day afterwards. So I try to keep it very, very agile, and be much more responsive.
I think one of my reflections is I was very reactive.
Where's Ball?
So it was inbox driven, or, meeting. Okay, what are the actions out of that? How do I need to follow that up? And I think that as in the year and a half that I was in government, and then particularly in the period after, I went from being reactive to trying to help shape agendas. So, okay, right. So what do we want to achieve here? What can I do to lift the pressure off the ministers? What's the political priority here? And how am I doing that? But I think I got to that too late.
So it's easy to get sucked in. You need to prioritise while being forced to be reactive. It's tricky. But before we move on, it's worth remembering that there are some firm limits on what SpAds can do and get involved in. The Special Advisor Code of Conduct is clear that SpAds can't manage civil servants in any way, for example, or authorise the spending of money.
Anything involving money, right? Like obviously like that had to all go through private office, right? Like it wasn't,
You weren't signing off spending decisions.
Yeah. You can just be like, there wasn't like government credit card I got, in my wallet and stuff, and be like, all right, okay, frankly, I could be ignored, because if I say, yeah, exactly, yeah, 2 more hospitals here, put it on the tab, I'm going to get told to, jog on, right? So everything there is so rigorous. And that was really helpful, right? Because I think often, if you're a special advisor, particularly a new special advisor, you don't know where the lines are, right? And you have to almost like cross the line before figuring it out, right?
But there are other areas too, which can depend on the department.
Most obvious one was like the security intelligence stuff.
Aled again, talking about the Cabinet Office.
That's a job for the pros. And it wasn't to say that, there wasn't a relationship with, say, like the NSA and the deputy NSA. I kind of felt that, but there was still, some things where even if, say, you were cleared for, the high side, it's better, right, isn't it, that they can speak completely frankly and so on and so forth. And so, that was one area, and particularly as well, like the way the spending review works as well. There is like a budget there for the kind of the intelligence agencies, and that is generally negotiated solo by the chief secretary.
When I moved into the Cabinet Office, sort of number 10 in Treasury, there were just some things that, unless you've got the appropriate clearance, from a security perspective, you're just not going to be allowed into the room.
Emma Dean.
Just not going to be able to see the advice. And if you do want to start getting involved in that, there's a lot of hoops you've got to jump through and a long process in order to do that. So there's a big question for special advisors as to whether it's worth it in terms of going through your security clearance process.
We've talked about the day-to-day and the balancing reactiveness and prioritisation. So we're going to spend the rest of this episode looking at how SpAds do actually add value for their ministers. And on that front, the important thing to remember is that they are not there to be policy experts.
I said to Matt, I was like, look, I just want to be really clear. I am not a health policy expert. You've had those in the past. If that's what you're looking for, I'm not it.
Emma Dean again.
And he said, look, I've got several thousand experts in my department who know everything there is to know about the policies that you're going to have to deal with. He said, that's not your job. He said, your job is to question everything, to ask the sensible questions, to provide a political lens on what it is that we're being given and what we're being asked to do, but also to spot crises before they become crises and to try and put out fires before they are fully aflame.
So I wasn't a policy expert.
Wes Ball.
I was more of a, I'd come from the party. I knew how the party worked. I knew how Parliament worked. I knew what the people landscape was, and I kind of picked up the policy as I went along. I knew a bit about environment policy, but I was not an expert. And every time you try to pretend to be an expert, you're pretending, and don't pretend.
And you're going to get flattened by the people who are experts.
Correct. Be what you are, right?
Ultimately, what you bring as a SpAd is that political nous. It's the view from the outside world.
Emily Walsh.
You're never going to be as knowledgeable on policy as the experts in the department. Obviously, it helps that you can follow the conversation, but actually, I think I put a lot of pressure on myself to know everything from the get-go. I think also there's something about honing your instincts and knowing your value. So being comfortable with sometimes being uncomfortable with the fact that you don't know anything. There are some discussions I sat in and I thought, goodness me, I don't understand a single thing that's being discussed. But that's okay. Your role is not to be the necessarily all over the sort of devil of the detail. Your role is to understand the politics of the situations.
Not being an expert, of course, also means that you can't be wasting your time getting bogged down in detail.
Detail is often death, right? If you're playing on the detail, you're going to lose, because if you think about special advisors in other departments, or like people who are, civil service departments, they live and breathe this stuff.
This is Aled again, talking about his experience at the centre of government.
A proposal that you've just seen for the first time. I'm looking down. There's an initiative. I've never heard of this initiative before, right? There are maybe hundreds, thousands of people who have been working on this initiative, right? So for me to come in after 20 minutes and be like, I think this and this and this about the details is wrong, right? Then I'm kind of going to get absolutely pulverized. My leeway to freelance was absolutely zero, and if I try it, it would end in disaster.
So if SpAds aren't experts and can't be immersed in the detail, what is it that they add?
I think I describe myself as the kind of ultimate sort of bouncer of a nightclub.
Hannah Guerin.
Because you are, from the moment you step in the building, the gatekeeper between the Secretary of State and the department, and you're constantly having to manage who's going in, who's going out. You are filtering absolutely everything that goes to the Secretary of State. So I would spend most of my time reading submissions, commenting on submissions, trying to get ahead of the policy curve, trying to have meetings with people to understand different points of view on policies. And I guess the rest of my time was spent trying to deal with the music I wasn't in control of in this nightclub setting, whether that be with ideas coming from Number 10 or problems with funding for different things, brokering agreements between departments and ultimately trying to add value. I think in the Home Office, you're also responding to press queries, the things that are coming in. I could have been reading a submission on, how to design the legal migration system, and suddenly you get a knock on the door, which is, some people have arrived at the border without a visa or a passport. What should we do? And that was quite a typical experience.
Hannah just mentioned the amount of time she spent reading and commenting on submissions. These are policy submissions, the stacks of papers going to the Secretary of State in endless red boxes, asking for decisions or views on anything the department's doing. Reviewing submissions, sending them back for changes, and finally adding your own views for your minister to see all take a huge amount of time for SpAds. We'll look at this a bit more in the next episode, but it's a critical part of how they add value.
There should always be a sort of opportunity for SpAd comments on anything that's going up to the minister.
Fraser Raleigh.
So we were a little bit less high-tech than things are now. So there were physical bits of paper with the submissions where you would scribble your thoughts on, that would go into the minister's box. So they had the private secretary's comments and your comments, and then it would come out the following morning with the minister's comment.
Emma Dean.
It was expected of me that I would look at every piece of advice that went into the Secretary of State's box on a day-to-day basis, and quite often that would be 30 to 50 pieces of advice that was going in, and having to kind of wanting to go through things and thoroughly read them, give your analysis, give your point of view, and you'd usually have about, in some cases, half an hour to go through all of that advice before the Secretary of State was heading out with their box. And so you have to realise that you've got to sort of very quickly get an idea of what's important and what isn't interesting, and what is interesting but has been made to look not interesting.
A less tangible but still important part of the SpAds role is, as Nikki Morgan refers to it, the intelligence role.
Because they are often the Secretary of State's eyes and ears within the department. And so the intelligence role that special advisors play, not in a sort of sneaking kind of way, but just a kind of, look, actually, the reason this policy brief hasn't arrived is because of X, or frankly, this is actually proving much harder to sort out than we had thought, or look, frankly, you do need to get involved in this to get it moving because it appears to be going absolutely nowhere. That is the kind of intelligence which is absolutely invaluable for a Secretary of State to have, and it's the kind of things often that people won't tell you because they don't want to be the bearer of bad news.
It's also worth remembering that, as Emma and Fraser said earlier, SpAds are more or less the only people who see everything the Secretary of State sees, as well as heaps of stuff that they don't need to. And this is useful in itself.
What's really unique about being a special advisor, and in my shoes covering kind of all of the breadth of the Home Office, was I was one of the few people seeing absolutely everything. And what that enabled you to do is make loads of connections that other people just simply didn't have visibility on.
Hannah Guerin again.
Someone in the office who wasn't the PPS, who might be a private secretary dealing with a specific policy area, wouldn't have the breadth of understanding across all of the different portfolios. So we just had a very simple rule that, they added comments, they were very helpful, but everything did come through us just to flush through anything that might not have been visible to them. And again, it kind of comes back to, you want everyone to do their job well. And ultimately, if the Secretary of State's seeing everything, then it's our job to cover all of the points. I think as well, there are things that the office just wouldn't see. And yes, they often were political, but were equally important to land the policy. And I think civil servants and officials do actually value that, because there is zero point in designing or announcing or trying to do something that is not going to land in the real world.
Perhaps the best way to get to the heart of what special advisors do is to look at what happens when everything's going wrong. So we're going to finish this episode by talking about crises.
Nobody who's worked in a department in number 10 or in the Treasury gets a full 5 years of nothing that sets them off course. If it's not a pandemic, then it's war. If it's not war, then it's weather. If it's not weather, then it's strikes. There's always something, and you have to sort of be agile.
Emma was working in the Department of Health and Social Care when the COVID pandemic hit.
I probably had a few moments at the beginning of the pandemic where it really hit us that this was going to be really significant. I think there was some early COBRA meetings where we were talking about reasonable worst case scenarios, which were particularly difficult. I think the added dimension for me as well is that my dad was still working on the front line. He was an anaesthetist working in a hospital, and my mother is clinically vulnerable. She's disabled, and he is her sole carer. So watching what was going on in Lombardy and seeing sort of what was happening to the medics out there, and knowing that I had people who were going to be really directly impacted and having to sit in those meetings where it was incredibly difficult.
While this was clearly a very difficult period, part of Emma's role was using that knowledge and experience to influence decision-making at the highest level.
I think with any good special advisor, what I hope I was able to do was sort of take that real-world experience and what I was hearing and seeing in terms of the direct impact from my family life and be able to feed that into conversations that were going on in terms of how policies were actually being played out, whether policy was getting to the front line in terms of what it is that we're trying to do. When we thought PPE, etc., was actually reaching the people that it needed to, was that actually the case? I remember very early doors my dad having to get tested and him just not really understanding how that was going to work, and whether the fact that because he was a doctor he did have access to testing, whereas the rest of the population didn't. So that was very helpful, albeit quite challenging in terms of trying to sort of separate out that sort of day job and personal life.
But going back to what we said earlier, you don't have to have that kind of knowledge of a particular area to be useful. A lot of the value of SpAds is in the Secretary of State empowering relatively knowledgeable non-experts just to speak their mind on things. They'll often spot things that have been missed during detailed policy work.
I found myself increasingly trying to speak up for women, for families, for people who lived in one-bedroom flats without gardens, and just trying to make sure that we were thinking through the consequences of decisions that were being made and how that was going to impact everybody, not just necessarily the demographic of people that might be sat around the table. The difficulty is, especially in a crisis situation, is that you are working on autopilot and you are often, you've got to go with the advice that's in front of you. Now, if the advice in front of you hasn't taken into account every facet of society and of life, then it takes a long time to make sure that you are sitting and properly thinking through the ramifications of decisions that are being made. And as soon as somebody goes, have we actually thought through the consequences of single parent families? People go, oh, crikey, no, we've not. Of course, we must, no, this isn't going to work. Okay, reverse, let's change this. And I can remember there was one change that had been made around, I think it was around family sort of care bubbles that hadn't properly thought through the consequences of sort of grandparents and or multi-parent multi-house families, and how that was going to practically work without making it illegal to basically let children move between sort of their parent and their father or different family members. So I think we'd laid the legislation on the Friday, realised the mistake fairly quickly and said, right, as soon as Parliament returns on Monday, we will fix it. But having to deal with a lot of people making representations about on how unhappy they were over the course of that weekend was very challenging, because we'd almost immediately realised our mistake, but by that point we'd done it.
I range crises on a kind of how the Guerin Richter scale of 1 to 5.
Hannah Guerin also faced more than her fair share of crises at the Home Office.
I guess a 1-2 would be someone's hijacked a tanker in the English Channel and it's on Sky News and we don't know anything about it. That would be something that would derail the week for probably 1 or 2 days, just because of the huge press interest and having to corral Whitehall to deal with that. I think the example two examples I've been in where they've been extreme crises where we've had to really react and be at the heart of that response is when Putin invaded Ukraine. So I remember waking up on a Sunday and literally having a barrage of messages, and we spent the whole day then designing the Homes for Ukraine scheme. And that went on for weeks, because essentially we had to break the immigration system in order to make that work. And under the microscope of intense media pressure and spotlight, that was a very difficult time, because you're having to design and change policies at pace which affect people, and it was really, really important to get that right. So that example is probably quite extreme, having to spend nights in hotels, up all night nearly with officials to get to the right answer. I remember drawing what would be the new visa regime on a piece of paper with a group of 6 officials, hashing it out for an hour. And then that being what we took forward, and having to then line up everything in Parliament. A further example would be the withdrawal of people who had helped forces in Afghanistan coming to the UK, a very similar situation, having to react at pace and ultimately make really important judgment calls under quite extreme pressure.
Those might be, as Hannah said, some extreme examples. But from filtering what goes to the Secretary of State to spotting connections invisible to anyone else, or providing that all-important external perspective, there are a whole range of ways that SpAd add value for their ministers. That's all we've got time for in this episode. If you'd like to find out more about how SpAds can do their jobs effectively and support ministers, check out our website, instituteforgovernment.org.uk, to see our IFG Academy resources for special advisors. Next time, we'll be talking about relationships. Almost everything a SpAd does relies on relationships, whether it's knowing their minister inside out or working seamlessly with the civil service. We'll be finding out how new SpAds can start to do this and just how important it is to keep a department ticking over. We hope you can join us then, but for now, thanks for listening to SpAdcast.